Hello everyone, I am ErickAlden, and welcome to the very first episode of the ErickAlden podcast. So today we're going to be taking a look at the life of H.P. Lovecraft. So for those of you that don't know, he's actually one of the most enigmatic horror writers of all time, and he's very iconic in the 20th century. He's basically the Edgar Allan Poe of the 20th century, and we're going to kind of take a look at the life that he experienced and, what made him this horror writer, this great, creepy storyteller. Because it is an interesting story in itself. So let's get right into it. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. So his early life. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, to Winfield Lovecraft and Susie Phillips. Winfield was a traveling salesman who worked for Gorham Manufacturing Company. Susie Phillips came from a wealthy family of aristocrats and disappointed her family when she married a lowly traveling salesman. Winfield had a mental breakdown in 1893 in a Chicago hotel, which ended up getting him institutionalized. He landed in an insane asylum called Butler Hospital. Isn't it sad when the love story turns into one of those, "Oh, I told you, my daughter. I told you not to marry that guy. I told you he was a nut," and every time. Hospital records about Winfield are very telling of his condition. For a year past, he has shown symptoms of mental disease, doing and saying strange things at times, has also grown pale and thin in flesh. He continued his business, however, until April 21st, when he broke down completely while stopping in Chicago. He rushed from his room shouting that a chambermaid had insulted him, and that certain men were outraging his wife in the room above. He was extremely noisy and violent for 2 days, but was finally quieted by free use of the bromides, which made his removal here possible. Yikes. Winfield passed away 5 years later in 1898 at Butler Hospital in Providence. And this is actually a very common theme amongst these dark writers, like the horror writers. Almost like 9 out of 10 times, I'd say even more than that, they have this tragic childhood, their parents died early, they experience terrible loss at a very young age. And I think that plays some kind of role in how it shapes their, brains and the kind of person they grow into. Even before Winfield was committed, he was mostly on business trips and seldom spent time with his family. When he was institutionalized, Lovecraft was already 3, and by the time he passed away, Winfield quickly became a distant memory for the future writer. It's pretty sad, actually. H.P. Lovecraft grew up in a family of adults with his mother's family, and one of the tragedies of growing up alone is that, you're surrounded by adults, you never really get a childhood. I mean, maybe you have a few friends here and there, but it's like you hanging out with a bunch of adults. So by the time you're 8, 9 years old, almost 90% of your interactions with other people has been grown-ups. So you're kind of going to lose out on that happy, fun, joyful time of your childhood. Lovecraft's maternal grandfather, Whipple von Buren Phillips, became the primary role model for the young, fatherless boy. Phillips was a successful businessman with most of his ventures in Providence, Rhode Island. Lovecraft later wrote of his grandfather, "My beloved grandfather became the center of my entire universe." He even helped the young Lovecraft overcome his fear of the dark, ironic, considering the nature of his future stories. Phillips also encouraged Lovecraft to study classical literature and English poetry, which had a profound impact on his intellectual development. And these early experiences, just knowing what he would do with his life, it's almost like just, very straightforward. It's like a very clear connection here, especially when people study this classical literature from a young age. That puts them way ahead of people that don't read classical literature until their 20s or sometimes never, as often is the case today. Lovecraft's childhood is characterized by being coddled by his overprotective mother. He spent most of his time reading and using his imagination to play in forts inspired by stories he'd read from books. He spent time in these make-believe forts until the late age of 17. He wrote, "Big boys do not play in toy houses and mock gardens, so I was obliged to turn over my worlds in sorrow to another and younger boy who dwelt across the lot from me." He began reading stories and reciting poetry at an early age and was obsessed with the artwork of Gustave Doré, the French artist whose illustrations became increasingly popular at the time. And this is a little bit of a side note, but Gustave Doré's artwork is some of the best. Go on Google Images and look at some of this stuff. You will be amazed. It is some great stuff. It's a blast. And it's almost too bad in a way, because he would, somewhat play this role of an influencer on Lovecraft. And I think it would have just been the perfect combination if Lovecraft had just been a little bit older. That way, Doré would have been able to illustrate some of Lovecraft's works. That would have been insane. His first tragedy in life was the death of his maternal grandmother at the age of 5. He wrote, "The death of my grandmother plunged the household into a gloom from which it never fully recovered. The black attire of my mother and aunts terrified and repelled me to such an extent that I surreptitiously pinned bits of bright cloth or paper to their skirts for sheer relief." Wow, again, so we go back to this very early childhood of tragedy. By the time he was 6, he became obsessed with 18th century literature and thought of it as a golden age for humanity. And this affinity for the 1700s, in particular, he loved the 1750s, so the 1780s. He thought this was the golden age of humanity. It would never be better than that, and we will never be as good as it was at that time. At 8, he taught himself the Greek alphabet and learned to speak Latin. He became so enthralled with ancient Greco-Roman culture that he genuinely adopted their religious beliefs for a time. He later wrote about the experience, calling it a confession of unfaith. "When about 7 or 8, I was a genuine pagan, so intoxicated with the beauty of Greece that I acquired a half-sincere belief in the old gods and nature spirits. I have, in literal truth, built altars to Pan, Apollo, Diana, and Athena, and have watched for dryads and satyrs in the woods and fields at dusk. Once, I firmly thought I beheld some of these sylvan creatures dancing under autumnal oaks, a kind of religious experience, as true in its way as the subjective ecstasies of any Christian." So, yeah, he's kind of a weird kid. I don't think it's very many people that they just find some old 2,000-year-old religion and yep, that's what I like. Around this time, he also discovered the work of Edgar Allan Poe and quickly became an enthusiast. He also read and studied writers of strange fiction who published their writings in pulp and fiction magazines. And this was a really cool time to be alive as a writer, because this was now when, the tools to create books and pamphlets and leaflets and any kind of literature, it was finally becoming accessible to your everyday kind of person. So it was kind of like that's why there's so many writers from this period that are remembered. How many famous writers are there from the 1600s, right? Not very many. And the ones that are famous from that time, they're the high nobility, total aristocrat. Whereas these people during this time now, it's you could be an average Joe. You can be anybody. And if you write really well, you can make a name for yourself. And that was kind of a cool thing. His next childhood interest was science. He even went as far to write scientific articles on chemistry, which he was able to sell for a few cents each. Another realm of science he excelled in was astronomy. He even gave a presentation of lantern slides to family and guests, which was unusual because he absolutely hated social interaction. So it wasn't very, late into his life where he realized he was a total recluse. So going out of his way to do this, he must have really liked astronomy as a kid. Yeah, the fact that he went through this really speaks to his love for astronomy. His friends jokingly called him Professor, and he even contemplated pursuing astronomy as a career. Unfortunately, it became clear this would never be a genuine possibility because he lacked an adequate understanding of math. Years later, he wrote, "That was the first major setback I ever received. The first time I was ever brought up short against the consciousness of my own limitations. It was clear to me that I hadn't brains enough to be an astronomer, and that was a pill I couldn't swallow." Kind of sad. Coping with this realization marked a very painful time in his life. On June 10th, 1908, he dropped out of high school, only ever going as far as 11th grade. The next few years of his life were almost entirely spent alone in his room. He only ever left at night so he wouldn't have to interact with anyone. And as you can imagine, he had pale skin, he had this, just kind of stay home and be alone all the time. A few bad investments left the family on hard times, with Lovecraft's mother starting to see her son as a failure, as he lacked both a job and an education. And keep in mind, this was a time when if you didn't have a job or an education as a man, that was terrible. Because, this is kind of like the old patriarchy, chivalry kind of society. So you were just a total failure if you were a man and you couldn't provide for yourself and a family and all that. During this time, his admiration for weird fiction turned into an obsession. His real life remained dull and tedious, while the fiction he immersed himself with seemed to get better with every turn of the page. So, your life is so bad you have to sit around and read dark, weird fiction that, nut jobs, right? What a life. In 1914, his luck turned around when he was invited to join an amateur press association. APAs were basically small communities of writers and thinkers who created their own magazines to be published together. He eagerly accepted the offer, writing, "With the advent of the United, I obtained a new will to live." And a moment like this is so interesting because you have to sit back and wonder, where would he have gone in his life if this hadn't happened? Because it did kind of just fall on his lap. He occasionally wrote into the Amateur Press Association, but, the invitation, normally people had to do more than what he did to get in. So you have to wonder, would he have become a writer? Would he have just settled down and got a real job? Or, it's who knows? He was a roaring success, first writing his own magazine, The Conservative. He became chairman of public criticism and then the organization's first vice president. So despite kind of feeling like a failure and kind of being one in his life, he was really smart. He had all this talent, energy, and drive. But it was there was just no way for him to put this somewhere. And the APA really kind of offered him an avenue to do that. He went on to create the Department of Instructions to teach aspiring writers proper grammar and spelling. This was before spell check and grammar check, and us today, we are nothing compared to them. They actually knew grammar. We don't even know the difference between your and your today. On April 6th, 1917, the United States entered World War I. Lovecraft, with a love for his country of origin, England, he tried enlisting as quickly as he could. Some time ago, impressed by my entire uselessness in the world, I resolved to attempt enlistment despite my almost invalid condition. I argued that if I chose a regiment soon to depart for France, my sheer nervous force, which is not inconsiderable, might sustain me till a bullet or piece of shrapnel could more conclusively and effectively dispose of me. Wow. What a dark thing to write. I mean, imagine writing that, actually thinking that about yourself. I mean, that one line right there, I resolved to attempt enlistment despite my almost invalid condition. So he almost didn't even view himself as like a valid person. Right? What a dark place to be, man. Given his poor health, he should have been rejected, but no background check was ever done. He was enrolled in the 9th Coast Artillery, which meant he probably wouldn't have to be sent to Europe. However, Lovecraft failed to inform his mother of his enlistment, who freaked out upon hearing the news. With the help of the family doctor, she convinced the officers at the recruitment station of Lovecraft's poor health. He was pulled out of the military and back under the control of his mother. Lovecraft was 26 when this happened. 26 years old. Wow, that is terrible. That is it would have been worth to just go over and die in the war. Then, that's terrible. His mother exercised complete control over her son, made all the worse by the fact they lived alone, just the two of them, since the death of Whipple Phillips, Lovecraft's grandpa, in 1904. The two struggled to survive financially, which put all the more strain on the relationship. So, Lovecraft's mother didn't want her son to leave. He was kind of, still struggling. He had the APA, and he was doing okay, advancing a little bit in the writing scene, but he still didn't have like a good job and stuck at home. I mean, some dark times. Lovecraft's mother's health was starting to deplete by 1918. Friends of hers wrote about awkward things she did in public, saying she'd forgotten where she was and constantly drew the attention of everyone around. And it's really hard to say what was going on with her at the time. I mean, it may very well have been like stress. She, kind of loses her marbles. Especially back then, psychology was still in its infancy. So by today's standards, we probably would have been able to really help a lot of these people. Especially Lovecraft's father, but now it's like first his father went crazy and now his mother is kind of going crazy. I mean, damn. In March 1919, she was admitted to Butler Hospital, the same place Lovecraft's father had died 21 years ago. Wow. This had a terrible impact on Lovecraft. He became even more of a shut-in and suffered from severe depression. It got so bad he even found it difficult to pen a letter. Instead, he spent most of his time now in bed. His mother's rapidly declining health led to him to write a poem entitled Despair. Thus the living, lone and sobbing, in the throes of anguish throbbing, with the loathsome furies robbing, night and noon of peace and rest, but beyond the groans and grating of apparent life is waiting, sweet oblivion culminating, all the years of fruitless quest. 2 years later, his mother would pass away in Butler Hospital. With time, Lovecraft would recover from the depression he experienced after his mother's death. He began attending writing lectures and various events to do with amateur journalism. In 1919, Lovecraft stumbled upon one of the biggest influences of his adult life, Lord Dunsany. Dunsany? I'm not 100% sure on that pronunciation. Lovecraft wanted nothing more than to emulate the Irish writer, going as far to adopt many elements of his style with his future writing. In 1920, Lovecraft shifted his focus on writing fiction. He wrote a number of short stories that were around 2,500 words in length, something he adopted from his role model, Lord Dunsany. He freed himself from Dunsany's shackles later that year when he wrote The Temple, which clocked in at 6,000 words. It was his longest story to date. The Temple is also significant for Lovecraft's fiction because it was the first of many stories to include the idea of a great and unknown human civilization. And yeah, that becomes a really big theme in his works, this whole lost knowledge, ancient civilization that we don't know anything about. There are people that think this kind of stuff today. It's hard not to. You see what people thousands of years ago did, and you're like, wow, they actually knew something. We have Google, the internet, all these tools, and, we know nothing. Where did we go wrong? Lovecraft gradually recovered from his mother's death. By the end of 1921, became an editor for a popular writer, David von Busch. He despised editing for Busch, but the pay was far more than any other writing job he could get. And this was back in a time when you can actually do editing and writing and really that could be your job. It's not really a thing anymore unless you write for some, big company or, something like that. By 1923, Lovecraft was spending most of his time with his friends, mostly fellow writers and literary enthusiasts. He even wrote to his aunt saying that he was feeling great and his headaches were gone. It would appear most of Lovecraft's poor health was psychosomatic. And psychosomatic basically just means that what you're feeling is from, what you think. You kind of bring it upon yourself. So if you get all stressed out and then you end up actually getting sick, it's because you were getting stressed out, not because, you had some kind of disease or there was anything wrong with you, really. And that kind of sucks because it's there's all this suffering that's going on and it's kind of needless and pointless. But, that's just, so far, man, this guy's life has been pretty bad. Lovecraft's adult life changed forever when he married one of his good literary friends, Sonia Green, who was born in Ukraine and came to America in her early life. It was through her own writing that she came to know and love H.P. Lovecraft. It's kind of nice when friends get married. Even after the marriage, though, Lovecraft was still the same cold, distant person he had always been. He was hardly interested in sex, which his wife later wrote that she had to initiate. Wow, that is weird, right? Normally it's the stereotype that the guy's always after sex and weird. I'll tell you, Lovecraft was a weird guy, man. Sonia later wrote of her marriage with Lovecraft, "I believe he loved me as much as it was possible for a temperament like his to love." Years later, one of the writers in Lovecraft's circle of friends, Samuel Loveman, said he married Sonia because she had an interest in his work, which made him feel obligated to marry her. Not very solid foundations to base your lifelong partnership off of, but, whatever floats your boat there, man. Before the excitement of marriage wore off, Lovecraft received one of his most interesting jobs yet, ghostwriting a story for the great Harry Houdini. Lovecraft lost the manuscript and him, with the help of his new wife, spent the next day and a half retyping it on a borrowed typewriter. When it was finished and submitted, Lovecraft was paid $100 for his work, the most he'd ever been paid for a single story to date, roughly $1,200 today. Now, what do you think? That's a lot of money for a single story. Imagine today writing a story that could land you $1,200. I want that job. By February of 1924, the couple faced their first real difficulties. Sonia had lost her $10,000 a year job, $120,000 in today's money, and Lovecraft was bouncing around with various forms of employment, remaining mostly unemployed for the time. He soon formed an unofficial club with his friends called the Calum Club. Lovecraft would spend quite a bit of time with his friends in this club, sometimes returning home to his wife as late as 9 a.m. the next day. Jesus, talking about, cracking a cold one with the boys. During this time, he wrote The Shunned House. He read it aloud to his friends and they excitedly told him it was his best work yet. In late 1924, Sony moved away to Cincinnati to take up a department store position. This kind of left the couple separated now, which is kind of a weird marriage situation. Despite living apart from his wife, Lovecraft noted he enjoyed the alone time and having the freedom to write in peace whenever he wanted. So it's almost like he cares more about being alone and being able to write than spending time with his wife. He was still unemployed, and the only things he did to occupy his time was write and visit friends. Sonia's job was enough to support the both of them, but she lost it due to conflicts with executives at the company. Lovecraft was primarily depending on his inheritance and money from his aunt by this point to support himself. Lovecraft, similarly to many other pulp fiction writers, was vehemently racist, which occasionally showed in his writing. The horror at Red Hook perfectly embodies Lovecraft's disdain for the other, often being summarized as a racist rant about foreigners that have stolen New York. Sony even wrote about his anger when they found themselves in a mixed-race crowd. He became livid with rage at the foreign elements he would see in large numbers. I would try to calm his outbursts by saying, "You don't have to love them, but hating them so outrageously can't do any good." Lovecraft responded with, "It is more important to know what to hate than it is to know what to love." Jesus, man, what the hell? This guy was a nut. Lovecraft believed other races were subhumans and felt this way not only about blacks and Hispanics, but any race that wasn't Anglo-Saxon British. He had a particular disdain for Poles and the Irish, and was even an anti-Semite, which is the ultimate irony considering he married an Eastern European Jewish woman. He praised his wife, though, for being assimilated. So he had a really weird outlook. I mean, it's one thing to hold these views, but he married an Eastern European Jew. I mean, there is some mental gymnastics going on there, maybe. I mean, he doesn't even like Poles, I mean, Ukraine is even, if you ascribe to this whole racist idea that the farther east you get, the worse they are. And I mean, if you ascribe to that, Ukrainians are worse than Poles. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of wish I could ask him some of these questions, how did this make sense? I really wish he elaborated more on these beliefs. On the topic of Lovecraft's opinions, he also rejected democracy in favor of fascism. He believed democracy and communism would eventually destroy Western civilization. After Benito Mussolini gained control of Italy, Lovecraft wrote, "Democracy is a false idol, a mere catchword, an illusion of inferior classes, visionaries, and dying civilizations." He saw in fascist Italy, quote, "the sort of authoritative social and political control which alone produce things which make life worth living." Fair enough. After a summer meeting with his friends in the Calum Club, he began working on the idea he had for a story. This story would go on to become the Call of Cthulhu. At the time, he also penned In the Vault, which would be rejected a few times before finally being published in Weird Tales a few years later. And he actually could have been a much more successful writer during this time, but what he did was he would write a story and he would think it's good. He would make, really get behind the story and he would submit it. And then if it was rejected, he was done with it. Which that's not the way you're supposed to be when you're in this scene at that time. The way you had to be was, okay, this story got rejected, let me revise it. Let me change this character. Let me make this a little bit more believable. Let me make this a little bit better. Let me change the ending. he wasn't about that at all. He just cared about, like, this way of writing stories. And I'm not sure if I have a point in here anywhere on it, but he believed that writing and literature was important, to like disregard money. And that's kind of, everyone feels that way to a certain extent about the art they love. It's just not profitable. And oftentimes it's like the more profitable your work is, the worse it is. I don't know why that is, but it's like, it is kind of true. I see, from being alive and being on the internet, I can say with some confidence that, yeah, there is some truth to that. Yeah, he just did not take advantage of that. And even that wouldn't even be like selling out, right? Because, revising your story and submitting it again, that's not being a money grubber, or anything. That's just like common sense. But, it's surprising that he was like able to make not an entire living, because he was kind of depending on his aunts and all that, but surprising that he could make any living at all. Between Lovecraft's separation from his wife and lack of employment, he fell back into his old habits, spending the majority of his time alone in his New York apartment reading weird fiction. So, that really is just back to the old ways, just like when he lived with his mom. He stopped spending time with his friends. When they would come to visit him, he would often not answer the door, pretending to be out. It was made all the worse by the fact he was away from his true home, Providence, Rhode Island. He never really viewed New York City as his home. He just kind of lived there, and just being in this kind of alien land, he wasn't there until like his 30s, I think, at this time. So it's just a weird place to be, and he's pretty much alone and doesn't care for his friends that much anymore. Yeah, he must have felt pretty isolated at this time. In a letter to one of his aunts, he wrote of screaming in sheer desperation and pounding the walls and floor. Wow, that definitely not a sign of mental health. When his aunt offered to pay for him to visit Providence, he declined, writing, "I couldn't bear to see Providence again till I can be there forever. A temporary glimpse would be like that of a distressed mariner swept by storm within sight of his own harbor, then washed away again into the illimitable blackness of an alien sea." Throughout this time, his aunt sent him Providence newspapers, and he continued studying Providence history as if he'd never left. So in his mind, just doing everything he can. I'm still there. I'm not in New York City. Going crazy. In April 1926, he finally returned home with great euphoria. This marked a serious change in Lovecraft's life. He became a much more productive writer, producing more fiction than ever before. A friend of Lovecraft's, W. Paul Cook, wrote, "He came back to Providence a human being. And what a human being! He had been tried in the fire and came out pure gold." Lovecraft's productive period came to an end in 1927 when he had trouble publishing one of his stories. The owner of the magazine didn't want to pay him, and after a few angry letters, finally gave in, but still only paid Lovecraft a fraction of what he was accustomed to for his stories. And that can be really discouraging, dealing with like the way money is, and it is a terrible headache. And I can only imagine, getting your story published in someone's magazine, they're selling a bunch of copies, and he's going to fight you on if you get paid or not. This would lead to him only wanting to write stories that were assured to be published. And that kind of really depended on one thing, and that's your reputation. If you don't have a reputation, there's a chance that your story gets rejected or turned down, or they want this or that revised. So, and that kind of sucks for Lovecraft because he didn't really have a reputation, right? Part of what makes him so great is that he kind of died poor. So this, way he's kind of continue forward is kind of sketchy, and there are definitely some things he could have done better as far as like the business side is concerned. Throughout this period, he had little contact with his wife, Sonia, and didn't visit her until the summer of 1928. She'd opened up her own business there, but Lovecraft neglected his wife that summer, instead spending most of his time with the former members of the Calum Club. So they're separated for all this time, and then finally they're together and he's hanging out with his friends. I mean, it didn't even really seem like a real marriage to begin with. Like, it was just kind of like, oh, you like my work? I kind of like you. Otherwise, I would be alone. And I don't like sex. And just so weirdo. After having lived most of their marriage apart, Lovecraft and Sonia decided to apply for a divorce in 1928. Sonia went on to marry again, but little did she know, Lovecraft never signed the final decree, meaning they were never truly divorced. So technically he died a married man, not that bad. The question of Lovecraft's maturity is often brought up concerning his marriage, his relationship with his mother, which left him being entirely controlled well into his adulthood, may have emotionally crippled him. And that really would explain quite a bit, because he never had like that opportunity to like mature and kind of grow. I mean, he was with his mom like well into his adult, I don't think it was until his mom died. So it's like, you're basically your mother's puppet from the time you're a little kid all the way until you're, like 30. I think he was like in his 30s by the time his mom died. So it's like, and even then it's by force. So he's like thrust out into this world. Hope you can form healthy relationships. Both of your parents went crazy and died in an insane asylum. The same one, by the way, Butler Hospital. Yeah, I don't think he had a fighting chance for ever really being like a functional human being. Lovecraft continued as a writer, mostly revising works of others, which he was very good at. He would often be sent nothing more than a rough plot, which he would transform into a full-length Lovecraftian original. And I've actually, through my research on this, there are actually quite a few people that believe that some of Lovecraft's best work is assigned to another person's name. Sending someone a rough plot and then taking that and turning it into something great. And he didn't really get all that much credit for it. He wasn't concerned with the money. He wasn't, if he made a living, he was like, yeah, whatever. So the fact that he spent all this time and energy and effort pretty much making work that he would, A, not get credit for, and B, not really get paid for, it kind of says something. He did really care about literature and fiction. He really did, maybe try to push human advancement in literature forward. If that makes any sense. That's his ideal. Lovecraft never seriously pursued writing. He thought of himself as an amateur and believed the commercial world was out of reach for his type of work. There are probably 7 persons in all who really like my work, and they are enough. So, and it's kind of weird because now, almost 100 years later, everyone knows his name. He's it's basically, H.P. Lovecraft is basically synonymous with weird fiction, and, everyone knows about the Call of Cthulhu, even if not everyone can spell or pronounce it. And he considered himself, kind of like an amateur. He never considered himself even good. Around 1930, Lovecraft penned The Whisperer in Darkness, which ended up getting Lovecraft paid a whopping $350 when it was published, over $5,000 today. This would be the most Lovecraft would ever receive for a single story. What an amount of money to be paid for a single story. Even by today's standards, $5,000. Damn. Hell, if I wrote one story and got paid $350, I'd be happy with that. Different times. Lovecraft tended to travel during the summer months, but in June 1932, he was called back home by telegram for a family emergency. His aunt Lillian became ill and passed away shortly after. He was very close with this aunt, having hundreds of letters exchanged, between the two of them. Regardless, Lovecraft still traveled, going to Boston and even as far north as Quebec in Canada. Lovecraft had a tendency of living very frugally during his travels. One of his writer friends, W. Paul Cook, wrote, "I have never before nor since seen such a sight. Folds of skin hanging from a skeleton, eyes sunk in sockets like burnt holes in a blanket, those delicate, sensitive artist's hands and fingers, nothing but claws. The man was dead, except for his nerves, on which he was functioning." If anything, it really kind of brings to life. Like, Lovecraft, he just didn't even care about himself. Like, oh yeah, I'm alive. That's enough. I don't need to eat full meals. The next few years of Lovecraft's life were uneventful. He had writer's block from 1934 into 1935. He made no money from any of his fiction. He wrote, "I was never closer to the breadline than this year." Toward the end of 1935, he was able to sell 2 of his stories with the help of a literary agent for a combined worth of $620, over $11,000 today, which I just got, what the hell? Inflation is crazy, man. So if anything, this presentation has made me so mad about inflation. In 1936, he spent most of his time and money caring for his elderly aunt, Annie. By Christmas, she was better and they were able to celebrate the beloved holiday together. Unfortunately, Lovecraft became ill himself. He developed what he called the grip. He wrote about being in pain, being bloated, and only being able to read or write for a few minutes at a time. In February 1937, a doctor visited Lovecraft and told him bad news. He apparently had terminal cancer in his small intestine and a kidney disease. The doctor prescribed pain pills but said there was no hope. Despite the bleak future, Lovecraft maintained optimism in front of his friends, only telling them he'd be indisposed for an indefinite amount of time. So he made the best of it, at least. It wasn't this terrible suffering, goodbye, I'm gonna die, and that's not the way to go out. However, the pain got worse and he was eventually transported to a hospital. He suffered in excruciating pain for days before finally passing away on March 15th, 1937. Yeah, so it was a really early death. He had this terrible experience going through it, but he still kind of made the best of it. At least, so there's some, there's a nugget in the infinite, bleak, terrible despair and tragedy that is this guy's life. Few of his friends were notified, so his funeral was only attended by his aunt and a small circle of friends. He was laid to rest at Swan Point Cemetery. His name only appeared initially on the central shaft of the Phillips burial plot, below those of his father and mother. It would be 40 years before his fans would raise the money to provide him with a separate headstone inscribed with his name, birth, and death dates, and the legend, "I am Providence." And I think that really sums up something beautiful. Because his life was just absolutely terrible, and his work, it touched people in a way that, years later, imagine your work, you die, and 40 years later, people not only remember you, they are so enthusiastic about you that they go and they put their own money together to get you a proper headstone. That, I gotta say, there's something beautiful about that. And I couldn't imagine him ever really being too happy at any point in his life. He was probably miserable way more often than not. But there is something kind of great about, having contributed to writing, to literature, to, even science fiction, right? He's kind of like the basis for that whole genre too. So it's kind of nice because his ideal in life was, create good fiction, create good literature. And he did that, and it really touched people. I think he would be happy knowing he had this effect, that he had this cult following. I mean, even where it's almost 100 years later, right? I mean, we could just see the way the language has changed. And there are still people that are crazy enthusiastic about his work. So, I think ultimately if he had like one life goal, he kind of accomplished that. So I hope you guys all enjoyed. Be sure to follow me on gab.ai. I have the ErickAlden URL, the official. So go follow me there. Check me. I don't use Twitter. I don't use Facebook. There's no good news coming from there. So follow me on Gab. They're about free speech. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.